The train slowed as it moved through the endless white fields of the American Midwest. Inside the dark freight cars, German prisoners of war pressed closer to the narrow slits in the wooden walls, trying to see where they were being taken. For weeks they had been traveling across an unfamiliar continent. First, the ships across the Atlantic under heavy guard, then long rail journeys through landscapes that seemed impossibly vast. Now it was December of 1944, and the cold had begun to creep through every crack in the train cars. Many of the men had never imagined they would end up in the United States. When they were captured in North Africa, Italy, or France, they assumed they would be kept somewhere in Europe. But America had other plans. By the middle of the war, the United States was holding hundreds of thousands of Axis prisoners. There were simply too many for camps in Britain and other Allied countries. The solution was to transport them across the ocean to prison camps scattered throughout the United States. For the prisoners, the journey itself felt surreal. They had grown up hearing about America in propaganda broadcasts and political speeches. In Nazi newspapers and radio reports, the United States was portrayed as a brutal enemy nation, dangerous, decadent, and hostile to Germans. Many prisoners believed that once they arrived, they would be treated harshly, perhaps even violently. Some feared they would be worked to death. Others imagined they would be locked away indefinitely in harsh camps far from the world. The reality during the voyage already seemed strange. On the ships crossing the Atlantic, American guards had not behaved as expected. They were firm and watchful, but not cruel. Prisoners were given regular meals. They were allowed time on deck for fresh air. Some guards even spoke a few words of German. These small details confused many of the men. It did not match the image of the enemy they had been taught to hate. Now the train was nearing its destination. Outside, snow was falling steadily, carried by a sharp wind that swept across the open plains. The prisoners could see forests of bare trees and frozen farmland stretching toward the horizon. For many of them, the cold was shocking. Winters in parts of Germany could be harsh, but the Midwest cold was different. It felt deeper, heavier, as if the air itself could freeze a man solid. Inside the train car, men wrapped their thin coats tighter around themselves. Some rubbed their hands together to keep warm. Others simply sat in silence, staring at the frost forming on the wooden walls. The uncertainty weighed on everyone. Where exactly were they going? What kind of camp awaited them? One of the guards walking alongside the train shouted a name that few of the prisoners had heard before: Camp McCoy. Camp McCoy was located in the state of Wisconsin, surrounded by forests and rolling hills. Originally built as a military training facility, it had been converted into a prisoner of war camp during the war. Like many American POW camps, it was designed according to the rules of the Geneva Convention. Prisoners were supposed to receive shelter, food, and medical care, but the German prisoners stepping off the train did not know any of this yet. When the train finally came to a stop, the doors slid open with a heavy metallic sound. Cold air rushed inside immediately. Snowflakes swirled through the open doorway. One by one, the prisoners climbed down from the train cars, boots crunching against the frozen ground. The first thing many of them noticed was the silence. Instead of shouting or chaos, the scene was strangely calm. American soldiers stood nearby, watching carefully but without hostility. They wore thick winter coats and steel helmets. Rifles hung over their shoulders, but none were pointed at the prisoners. For the German soldiers, the moment felt tense and uncertain. Some expected insults or punishment. Others feared sudden violence, but none of that happened. Instead, the guards began organizing the prisoners into lines. Their voices were firm but controlled. Orders were given in English, sometimes repeated in German by interpreters. The prisoners were counted and directed toward waiting trucks that would take them into the camp. Snow continued falling steadily, covering the ground in a thick white blanket. For many prisoners, the cold quickly became unbearable. Their uniforms had been designed for European battlefields, not for standing in a Wisconsin winter. A few men began shivering uncontrollably. That was when something unexpected happened. One of the American guards approached a young prisoner whose hands had turned red from the cold. Without saying much, the guard removed a thick wool scarf from his own neck and handed it to the prisoner. The German soldier hesitated for a moment, unsure how to react. Then he accepted it quietly. The small gesture confused many of the prisoners who witnessed it. They expected cruelty, not kindness. As the trucks carried them toward the camp, the prisoners could see rows of wooden barracks surrounded by fences and guard towers. Smoke rose from chimneys, suggesting that the buildings were heated. Lights glowed faintly through frosted windows. Camp McCoy was not luxurious by any means. It was a prison camp in the middle of wartime, but it was also organized, structured, and surprisingly orderly. When the prisoners were led inside the barracks, they found rows of bunks waiting for them. Blankets were stacked neatly at the foot of each bed. In another building nearby, hot food was being prepared. For men who had spent months on battlefields and weeks traveling across oceans and continents, the scene felt almost unreal. Many of them still remained cautious. They had been trained not to trust the enemy. Some believed the kindness might be temporary. Others suspected it was some kind of trick. But the longer they stayed, the more their expectations began to shift. The guards did not beat them. Meals arrived regularly. Medical staff treated those who were sick or injured. Rules were enforced, but the atmosphere was not of hatred. In quiet conversations late at night inside the barracks, prisoners began discussing what they were experiencing. Some admitted that the reality of American captivity was nothing like what they had been told. Others were still skeptical. After all, the war was still raging across Europe. Friends and family back home were still facing bombing raids, shortages, and uncertainty. Yet here, thousands of miles away in the snowy forests of Wisconsin, something strange was unfolding. Men who had arrived expecting brutality were beginning to encounter something else entirely. Not friendship, not freedom, and certainly not comfort, but something that felt unfamiliar in the middle of a brutal world war. A strange and unexpected sense of humanity. For the German prisoners stepping into Camp McCoy on that freezing December day in 1944, the war had just taken a turn they never could have predicted, and the deeper winter had yet to come.
The cold arrived slowly at first, like a quiet warning that something far more powerful was coming. In early December of 1944, the German prisoners at Camp McCoy were still adjusting to their new surroundings. Many of them had spent the previous months fighting in Europe, where winters could be harsh, but nothing they had experienced had truly prepared them for the American Midwest. Wisconsin winters were famous for their severity. Temperatures regularly dropped far below freezing. Winds swept across open farmland and forests with almost nothing to stop them. Snowstorms could blanket entire regions overnight, and the cold had a way of penetrating through layers of clothing until it reached the bone. For the prisoners who had just arrived, the first shock was stepping outside in the early mornings. Frost covered every surface. The ground was frozen hard, and each breath created a cloud of white vapor in the air. Even the wooden barracks creaked and groaned as the temperature dropped through the night. Many of the prisoners did not yet own proper winter clothing. Their uniforms had been issued for combat zones in Europe, not for surviving long hours in sub-zero temperatures. Gloves were thin or missing. Boots were worn and not insulated well enough for standing in deep snow. The cold quickly became the enemy no one had expected. Some prisoners developed painful cracks in their skin from the dry, freezing air. Others struggled with numb fingers and toes after only a short time outdoors. A few began showing early signs of frostbite, something many had only heard about but never experienced themselves. Inside the barracks, conversations often turned to the same subject, the cold. Men who had fought artillery battles and survived bombings now found themselves worrying about the simple act of walking across a snow-covered yard. At first, many believed the American guards simply did not care about their discomfort. After all, they were prisoners of war. In the minds of many German soldiers, harsh treatment seemed like the most likely outcome. But once again, reality began to challenge those assumptions. One morning, during a particularly bitter cold spell, several prisoners were ordered to gather outside for routine movement between sections of the camp. The temperature had dropped to dangerous levels overnight. The wind cut through clothing like a blade. A few prisoners began shivering violently while waiting in line. One older soldier struggled to move his fingers, which had become stiff and pale from the cold. An American guard noticed immediately. Instead of ignoring the problem, he approached the line and began speaking with the interpreter. Within minutes, several guards returned carrying boxes filled with winter gear, thick gloves, scarves, and wool caps. The prisoners watched in confusion as the items were handed out. Some of the guards even demonstrated how to wrap the scarves properly around the neck and face to protect against the wind. For many prisoners, it was the first time they had seen enemy soldiers actively trying to prevent them from getting sick or injured. The explanation was simple, though few of the prisoners fully understood it at the time. According to the Geneva Convention, prisoners of war were required to be treated humanely. The United States took those rules seriously, both for moral reasons and because American soldiers captured by Germany would hopefully receive the same treatment. But for the German prisoners standing in the snow that morning, the moment felt almost personal. The guards were not simply following rules. Some of them seemed genuinely concerned that the prisoners might suffer in the freezing temperatures. Over the following weeks, small lessons about surviving the Wisconsin winter began to spread through the camp. American guards showed prisoners how to layer clothing to trap warmth. They explained why keeping feet dry was essential to avoid frostbite. Some demonstrated how to wrap blankets tightly around the shoulders when walking between buildings during storms. Even the way people moved through snow became a subject of instruction. Prisoners who tried to rush across icy ground often slipped and fell, while locals who had grown up in the region moved slowly and carefully, placing each step deliberately. The German soldiers began to observe and imitate these habits. Inside the barracks, heating stoves became the center of daily life. Prisoners gathered around them in the evenings, drying damp gloves and boots while sharing stories from home. The smell of burning wood filled the rooms, mixing with the sounds of quiet conversations in German. Outside, winter storms occasionally swept across the camp with incredible force. Snow piled up against buildings and fences. Guard towers became ghostly shapes, barely visible through the swirling white wind. During one particularly severe storm, visibility dropped so low that even the guards struggled to see across the camp. Work and outdoor movement were temporarily halted. For many prisoners, the storm revealed something surprising about their captors. Instead of leaving the prisoners to endure the freezing conditions alone, the guards worked to ensure that the barracks remained heated and supplied. Extra firewood was delivered. Additional blankets were distributed to men who needed them. Medical staff checked for signs of frostbite or illness. These actions slowly changed the atmosphere inside the camp. At first,
Prisoners spoke about the guards with suspicion and hostility. They were the enemy, after all. But as the weeks passed, many began to see them differently. The guards still carried rifles. The fences still stood tall around the camp. Escape was impossible. Yet the daily interactions were no longer defined entirely by fear. Some guards began learning simple German phrases to give instructions more clearly. A few prisoners, in return, practiced their English when speaking with the soldiers during routine tasks. The barrier between enemies did not disappear, but it became less rigid. One evening, as snow drifted quietly outside the barracks, a young German prisoner wrote in his diary about the strange reality he was experiencing. He had expected brutality when he was captured. Instead, he found himself learning how to survive winter from the very soldiers he had once fought against. He admitted that the cold of Wisconsin was more powerful than any enemy he had faced on the battlefield. But he also realized something else. Without the help of the Americans guarding the camp, that cold might have become deadly.
By early 1945, the routine at Camp McCoy had begun to settle into a strange rhythm. The German prisoners had grown used to the fences, the guard towers, and the strict schedules that organized every part of the day. Morning roll calls, meals in the mess hall, and long hours inside the barracks had become normal. But outside the camp, another problem was growing across the United States. Millions of American men were fighting overseas in Europe and the Pacific. Farms, factories, and railroads back home were suddenly missing workers. In rural states like Wisconsin, the shortage of labor became especially serious. Crops still needed to be harvested, livestock needed to be cared for, and fields had to be maintained through the winter months. The solution for many communities was unexpected: prisoners of war. Under international agreements, captured soldiers could be assigned to certain kinds of work as long as the tasks were not directly related to the war effort. Agricultural labor was considered acceptable. Soon, German prisoners from camps like Camp McCoy were being organized into work groups and sent out under guard to nearby farms. When the prisoners first heard about the plan, many of them were nervous. They had no idea what kind of treatment they would receive outside the camp. Some imagined angry civilians who had lost sons or brothers in the war. Others feared being forced into brutal labor under harsh conditions. On a cold morning, a group of prisoners was loaded onto a truck and driven through the snowy countryside. For many of them, it was the first time they had seen the American landscape beyond the fences of the camp. The roads passed through small towns and open farmland. Wooden barns stood beside frozen fields, their roofs covered in snow. Smoke rose from farmhouse chimneys into the pale winter sky. The prisoners watched quietly, unsure of what awaited them. When the truck finally stopped, they were greeted not by soldiers, but by farmers. The men waiting for them were dressed in heavy work coats and boots, their faces weathered from years of outdoor labor. Some of them spoke little or no German. The prisoners, meanwhile, knew only a few words of English. At first, the meeting felt awkward and tense. These farmers knew that the men standing in front of them had once been enemy soldiers. Some of those prisoners had fought in battles where American troops were killed. The war was still ongoing overseas. Yet the work still needed to be done. The guards explained the basic rules. The prisoners would work during the day and return to the camp afterward. They would be supervised but not mistreated. In return, the farmers would receive the labor they desperately needed to keep their farms running. Then the work began. For many German prisoners, farm labor was not entirely unfamiliar. Some had grown up in rural areas before the war. They knew how to handle tools, repair fences, and care for animals.
Others had been city workers or students and had to learn quickly. The tasks varied from farm to farm. Some prisoners helped chop wood for heating, others cleaned barns or fed animals. In some places, they helped repair equipment that had broken during the long winter months. At first, conversations were limited to gestures and simple words. A farmer might point toward a stack of firewood and mimic the motion of chopping. A prisoner would nod and begin working. Slowly, both sides began picking up bits of each other's language. Simple phrases were exchanged. Numbers, directions, and basic instructions became easier to communicate. Something else began to happen as well. The farmers noticed that many of the prisoners were young. Some were barely out of their teenage years. They looked tired, thin, and far from home. The prisoners, meanwhile, noticed that the farmers were not hostile. In fact, many of them seemed grateful for the help. During breaks in the workday, the farmers sometimes offered hot coffee or sandwiches. The prisoners accepted cautiously at first, unsure whether such kindness was genuine. But day after day, the same pattern continued. Work in the cold fields, shared meals in the barns, and quiet conversations that slowly grew longer as trust developed. One Wisconsin farmer later remembered how strange the situation felt. Only months earlier, the newspapers had been filled with stories about brutal fighting in Europe. Yet now he was standing beside German soldiers, working together to repair a broken fence. The war still existed somewhere far away across the ocean, but here on the farm, the daily concerns were simpler. Animals needed feeding, equipment needed fixing, snow needed clearing from paths and roads. For the prisoners, the experience was even more surprising. They had expected hatred from American civilians. Instead, they found people who treated them like workers, sometimes even like guests. Some families allowed the prisoners to eat lunch inside the farmhouse kitchen during particularly cold days. Children in the family would stare curiously at the strange uniforms and unfamiliar accents. In return, some prisoners shared stories about their homes in Germany. They spoke about small villages, farms, and families they had not seen in years. Despite the language barrier, a kind of understanding began to grow. The prisoners worked hard, partly out of pride, and partly because the work provided a break from the monotony of camp life. Farmers began requesting the same work crews repeatedly, knowing they could rely on them. American guards remained present, but their role often became more relaxed during the workdays. Many guards realized that the farmers depended heavily on the prisoners' help. By the end of winter, something remarkable had happened. In places where enemy soldiers might have been expected to meet with hostility, cooperation had quietly rooted take. German prisoners were helping keep American farms alive during wartime. Farmers who had never imagined speaking to a German soldier were now sharing daily tasks with them. The war still existed somewhere far away across the ocean, but
as the winter slowly settled over Wisconsin, daily life for the German prisoners began to feel less like pure captivity and more like a strange, uncertain routine. The fences were still there, the guards still carried rifles, the war still raged thousands of miles away in Europe, yet something inside Camp McCoy had begun to change in ways that none of the prisoners had expected when they first stepped off the train. The change was not sudden. It grew slowly, through small moments that at first seemed almost insignificant. A warm cup of coffee handed to a prisoner after hours of working outside in the snow, a short conversation between a guard and a prisoner while standing near the barracks, a shared laugh when someone struggled to pronounce a word in the other's language. At the beginning, most German prisoners kept their distance. Years of propaganda and wartime experience had taught them that the enemy was dangerous and cruel. Many had grown up hearing that Americans were weak, chaotic, or even barbaric.
The idea that American soldiers might treat them with respect seemed impossible, but the reality they were living began to challenge those beliefs. One evening, shortly before Christmas of 1944, snow covered the entire camp in a thick white layer. Inside the barracks, prisoners gathered around the heating stoves as the temperature outside dropped far below freezing. Some of the men began quietly singing traditional German Christmas songs. The melodies were soft, almost fragile in the cold night air. For many of the prisoners, it was the first Christmas they had spent far away from their families. One of the American guards standing outside the barracks heard the singing. Curious, he stepped closer to the door and listened for a moment. The song was unfamiliar to him, but the emotion in the voices was impossible to miss. Instead of interrupting, he simply stood there and listened. Later that evening, something unexpected happened. The camp authorities allowed a small Christmas gathering for the prisoners. It was not a grand celebration, nothing like the holidays the men remembered from home, but there were small gestures that made the moment meaningful. Extra food was served in the mess hall. Hot drinks were distributed. In one corner of the room, a simple Christmas tree had been placed, decorated with basic ornaments and paper stars. For men who had spent years in the chaos of war, the sight was almost surreal. Some prisoners later wrote in their diaries that it was one of the most emotional moments of their captivity, not because it was luxurious, but because it reminded them that they were still human beings. American guards watched the gathering from a distance. A few even exchanged quiet holiday greetings with the prisoners through interpreters. For many German soldiers, the experience forced them to confront an uncomfortable realization. The enemy they had been taught to hate was behaving with kindness. One prisoner named Karl wrote later that the moment confused him deeply. He had believed that if he were ever captured, he would be treated with cruelty or humiliation. Instead, he found himself standing beside American soldiers who were sharing a simple Christmas moment with him. The feeling did not erase the reality of the war. Karl still knew that his country and the United States were locked in a brutal conflict, but the personal experience was impossible to ignore. Similar moments continued throughout the winter. Some prisoners who worked on local farms began forming cautious friendships with the families they helped. Farmers sometimes asked about Germany, curious about the places where the prisoners had grown up. The prisoners, in return, asked questions about American life. Children were often the most curious. They would stare at the uniforms, fascinated by the strange language and accents. Sometimes they would ask simple questions through their parents or through gestures. Where are you from? Do you have a family? What is Germany like? The answers were often simple, but they created small bridges between people who had once been enemies. Even the American guards experienced a shift in perspective. Many of them had expected the prisoners to be hostile or difficult. Instead, they discovered that most were simply young men caught in the machinery of war. Some guards were barely older than the prisoners they were watching. They shared similar stories of homes left behind, families waiting for news, and uncertainty about the future. The realization created an uneasy but powerful understanding. War had placed them on opposite sides of a battlefield, but in many ways their lives were not so different. This quiet human connection had an unexpected side effect inside the camp. Hardline Nazi loyalists among the prisoners began losing influence. Earlier in the war, some prisoners had tried to maintain strict ideological control within the camps, insisting that loyalty to the Nazi regime must remain absolute. They warned others not to trust the Americans and accused anyone who cooperated too easily of betrayal. But as the months passed and prisoners continued experiencing humane treatment, those arguments became harder to maintain. Reality was contradicting the propaganda. Men who had once repeated Nazi slogans now found themselves working peacefully beside American civilians, eating meals prepared by American cooks, and receiving medical care from American doctors. For many German prisoners, the experience forced them to rethink everything they had been told about the world beyond Germany. Not everyone changed their views immediately. Some remained suspicious or angry, but the seeds of doubt had been planted. Inside Camp McCoy, winter continued to grip the land. Snowstorms still swept across the frozen forests, and the cold remained as harsh as ever. Yet within the fences of the camp, something unusual had begun to grow. It was not friendship in the full sense. The war still existed, and everyone knew that their roles as enemies had not disappeared. But there was a growing sense that the line between enemy and neighbor was not always as clear as the world of war had claimed. And for many of the German prisoners, that realization would stay with them long after the war finally ended.
By the spring of 1945, the long winter over Wisconsin began to loosen its grip. Snow slowly melted from the fields surrounding Camp McCoy. The frozen ground softened, and the forests that had stood silent and gray for months began to show the first signs of new life. Inside the camp, the German prisoners noticed the change immediately. After months of cold winds and deep snow, even a slightly warmer breeze felt like relief. Work crews continued traveling to nearby farms, but the atmosphere felt different now. News from Europe was changing everything. For months, rumors had circulated through the camp. Prisoners gathered around newspapers, translators, and guards who shared small pieces of information about the progress of the war. The German army was retreating on multiple fronts. Allied forces were advancing deep into German territory. Cities were falling one after another. Many prisoners felt a growing sense of anxiety. Some worried about their families back home. Others wondered what kind of Germany would still exist when the war finally ended. Then, in May of 1945, the news arrived that would change their future completely. Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was over. The announcement spread quickly through Camp McCoy. Some prisoners heard it from American guards. Others read the news posted on bulletin boards inside the camp. At first, many refused to believe it. The idea that the war had ended felt almost unreal. For years, their lives had been defined by conflict, propaganda, and survival. Now, suddenly, the fighting was finished. The reactions among the prisoners were mixed. Some felt relief that the destruction was finally ending. Others experienced deep sadness or uncertainty about what awaited them back home. Germany had been heavily bombed. Cities were destroyed. Governments had collapsed, and millions of people were displaced. No one knew what kind of future waited on the other side of the Atlantic. But even though the war was over, the prisoners did not leave immediately. Transporting hundreds of thousands of prisoners across the ocean would take time. Ships needed to be organized, routes secured, and arrangements made with the devastated countries of Europe. So the German prisoners remained in the United States for months, and in some cases more than a year after the war ended. During that time, life at Camp McCoy continued much as it had before. Prisoners still worked on farms, still followed daily routines, and still lived inside the fences that had surrounded them since their arrival. But something had changed in the atmosphere. The tension that once defined the relationship between prisoners and guards had softened even further. Now that the war was over, both sides understood that their roles as enemies were coming to an end. Some American guards began speaking more openly with the prisoners about life outside the camp. They talked about their own families, their hometowns, and what they hoped to do once military service ended. Prisoners shared their own hopes as well. Many simply wanted to return home and rebuild their lives. Some dreamed about finding their families again after years of separation. Farmers who had worked with prisoner labor crews also faced a strange moment of transition. Over the previous months, they had grown used to the presence of German workers helping on their farms.
In some cases, those workers had become reliable partners in daily labor. Now they knew that soon the prisoners would be gone. There were quiet goodbyes in barns and farmyards, handshakes between men who had once stood on opposite sides of a global war. A few farmers even wrote letters later describing how strange the experience had been. They had expected to feel anger toward the enemy soldiers sent to work on their land. Instead, they discovered that many of the prisoners were simply ordinary young men who had been caught up in forces far beyond their control. For the prisoners themselves, leaving America carried complicated emotions. They were eager to return home, but many also carried memories that did not match the stories they had been told before the war. The United States they had encountered was not the cruel enemy described in propaganda broadcasts. They had been given food when they were hungry, medical care when they were sick, warm clothing when the winter threatened their survival. Some had shared meals with American families. Others had formed quiet friendships with farmers or guards. These experiences stayed with them. Years later, many former prisoners would return to the United States as visitors. Some traveled back to Wisconsin to see the places where they had once worked during captivity. A few even reconnected with the families who had treated them kindly during those difficult months. The story of German prisoners in American camps slowly became known through diaries, letters, and historical records. It revealed a side of World War II that many people had never considered. A story not just about battles and destruction, but about the choices people made even in the middle of war. The fences at Camp McCoy had once marked the boundary between enemies, yet within those fences, moments of humanity had quietly unfolded, moments when guards chose compassion over cruelty, and prisoners responded with respect rather than hatred. When the last prisoners finally boarded ships to return to Europe, they carried those memories with them across the Atlantic. The war had taken years from their lives. It had brought suffering to millions across the world. But in the frozen winters of Wisconsin, something unexpected had also emerged. Proof that even during the darkest conflict of the 20th century, simple acts of kindness still had the power to change how enemies saw each other. And for the men who had lived through it, that lesson would remain long after the war itself had faded into history.